Welcome to our Bible study for this week. This week, our study is the beginning of Jesus' Sermon on the Mount that we find in Matthew. The whole Sermon on the Mount is Matthew 5, 6, and 7. We're only going to look at the Beatitudes, and then I want us to look at the 20th verse in here this week. It would take days and days and days to study the entire Sermon on the Mount. But our lesson writer does suggest that the Sermon on the Mount we can see kind of as Jesus' manifesto. It's a distillation of all of his teachings, and it's particularly a wonderful distillation of the way that his teachings coincide with action. This is a very practical sermon in terms of it gives us lots of things that we are to do. Now, we may find it to be impractical in how we apply it to our lives, because if we apply it to our lives, we're going to be doing things differently than we would naturally want to do things, differently than the world would tell us that we ought to do things, but very practical in terms of how are we to live if we really are to live as kingdom people. So let me share with you the Beatitudes and then the 20th verse, and then we'll talk about them. Jesus says in the Sermon on the Mount, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. Blessed are the merciful, for they will receive mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called the children of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted for the sake of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when people revile you and persecute you and utter all kinds of evil against you falsely on my account. Rejoice and be glad, for your reward is great in heaven. For in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you." And then the 20th verse, "For I tell you, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and the Pharisees, you will never enter into the kingdom of heaven." Now, I've heard the Beatitudes described as the Be-attitudes. These are the attitudes that Jesus wants us to have in order to live our lives. In one sense, that may be true, but I think we need to ask the question, is Jesus giving us a prescription for life? Well, if you are going to live correctly, then you have to have all of these particular attitudes. And on the one hand, I think the answer is yes. The rest of the Sermon on the Mount is going to continue to reinforce that we are to be meek, even though the world doesn't think that that's the pathway to success. We are to be pure in heart. We are to be merciful. We are to be peacemakers. All of those things are obviously kingdom values that Jesus is going to teach us about and elaborate on further. And yet, how many of us really want to be poor in spirit, to feel like that we don't have what we need spiritually? Or in Luke's gospel, it simply is poor. Blessed are the poor. We may recognize that we don't need to be fabulously wealthy in order to be happy, but we may not want to be poor to be lacking in material things or lacking in spiritual things. How many of us want to mourn? The answer there, I hope, is none of us would seek out mourning. That's not an attitude I want to have. I know that from time to time in my life I will mourn the losses that I have, but I don't want to seek it out. How many of us want to be persecuted? And again, none of us want to be persecuted. We want to do the right thing, and if we have to pay the price of doing the right thing, okay, but again, we're not going to necessarily seek that out. And so I want to argue that maybe Jesus is really being descriptive rather than prescriptive. He's describing the fact that there will be times when you are poor in spirit, and rather than beating yourself up or falling into despair, you can recognize, maybe I'm poor in spirit, but Jesus promises that mine will be the kingdom of heaven. And what I see there is that heaven will be revealed to me, and I will discover that I do have what I need, or I'll be given what I need. What about those times when I do mourn? Well, when I do mourn like Jesus, it's fine for me to weep, but I can recognize that eventually I will be comforted, and that can be the light shining in the darkness. Even when I'm persecuted, I can recognize that, again, just as those who are poor in spirit, theirs is the kingdom of heaven. And really, those who are persecuted, Jesus says later that you're being just like the prophets before you. So you're actually bringing the kingdom of heaven into earth. That's how you will receive the kingdom of heaven, is that you are bringing it into earth by your persecution, by doing what you did to be persecuted. And so so think about people you know of whom you know are meek, or who are peacemakers, or who are merciful. And I bet that if you don't see them as people who are blessed, and I bet you do, because they know the secret to life, if you will, that others don't. But even if you don't see them as blessed, I bet you see them as people who have blessed you in some way, and how beautiful and powerful that is. The kingdom of heaven is just around and with them, even if they don't always notice it. But I do think we need to recognize, and here's where I think the be attitude kind of falls apart. I can't just resolve that with my own interior strength, I am going to be merciful. I am going to be pure in heart. I am going to be a peacemaker. All of those things are so terribly hard to do if I rely just on my own strength. And I actually know that I'll fail. I have made some of those resolutions before and failed. And it doesn't take long for temptation to slip in there and me find myself doing exactly the opposite of what I want to do. And Paul even writes about how the very thing I want to do, I can't do if I'm relying just on myself. I think we also need to be honest and say that in spite of how wonderful these promises are, we can all cite examples where it seems to be the promise is exactly the opposite if I find myself in this situation. You may know of someone who has just suffered unrelenting grief, and for a long time their losses have mounted up so much that there just is no comfort for them. And I would argue that there's even a biblical example of that in Matthew itself, just a few chapters before, back in Matthew 3, when Herod slaughters all of the innocent children. Matthew quotes from Jeremiah and says that Rachel is weeping for her children, and she refuses to be consoled because her children are no more. And there are times when we can't just say, well, I'm mourning and I'm going to be comforted and that'll just have to be enough for me. The mourning can be so terribly awful, and our losses can be so awful that we may even feel like Rachel. I am weeping and I refuse, at least for right now, to be consoled. Don't tell me I'm going to be comforted. That's not going to help me. Now, the comfort will come eventually. I do trust and believe, if we can find a way to turn that over to God. But it may be a long and terrible, torturous path. And in a bad way, that just has to be okay. And we, if we're on the outside, just have to find a way to walk with our friends through the valley of the shadow of death. And if they think they'll never emerge on the other end, us just trying to push them through may not work. We just have to walk with them through it. Likewise, peacemaking is a wonderful thing, and yet peacemaking is a great way to get shot. You can get shot in the crossfire when you're trying to make peace between two warring factions, and sometimes if you try to make peace even with someone who is you are estranged from in some way, that may be a way for them to shoot at you. Martin Luther King Jr., whom we celebrated this past week, he based a lot of his life and thought and practice in the Sermon on the Mount, in being merciful, in being meek, in being peacemakers. And yet we see that it cost him his life. It may be well that Jesus put peacemaking right before persecution because he knew that it would happen. And so we might think, well, I'm not sure I want to be a peacemaker. I'd like to be called a child of God, but maybe not at the price of being persecuted. And so I think that brings up for us the question, first, how can we achieve what Jesus asks us to achieve? We know we can't do it on our own strength. And then secondly, I think it's fair to ask the honest question, do we really want to achieve these things? If I go after these things, I may find that I don't get the promise immediately, and maybe it's just not worth it to me. And so let's think about that for a minute. And those are uncomfortable questions, but that's okay. That's we need to ask uncomfortable questions. And I want to begin to answer those, or to at least pose some ways we might answer those with N.T. Wright, who's one of my favorite biblical scholars, and his take on the Beatitudes. And in one of his commentaries, he talks about the movie The Right Stuff. And you may remember in that movie, it's about the beginnings of the United States eventually making it to the moon, the early days of the space race. And it begins with us trying just simply to break the sound barrier, long before we ever tried to break through the atmosphere, just to break the sound barrier. And the early attempts, the pilots that were flying those planes, as they got closer and closer to the sound barrier, the planes got more and more unstable, and the controls quit working, and they all had to bail out as the plane went and crashed into the desert. And then finally, Chuck Yeager is able to achieve breaking the sound barrier. In the movie, he says that as my plane's controls quit working, I got this weird idea. I started doing exactly the opposite with the controls of what I wanted the plane to do. And when I worked the controls in reverse, then the plane did what I wanted it to do. Wright says in that commentary that later Yeager said the movie didn't get that exactly right, that wasn't exactly right. But he said, let's hang on to that metaphor. The Christian life, breaking through not the sound barrier, but breaking through into the kingdom of heaven, is kind of like discovering that all the rules that the world thinks we live life by don't work in the kingdom of heaven, and we have to start using them, working them backwards. And so if we want to achieve an awful lot in the world, if I want to acquire a lot, I'm not going to be meek by the world's standards. I'm going to be aggressive. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. No. I'm going to be aggressive and take what I want. It doesn't work that way in the kingdom of heaven. And Jesus is not telling us that the kingdom of heaven is something in the far off future, but the kingdom of heaven is here among us right now, Jesus says. And so I start living as a person who is meek, and the kingdom of heaven starts to blossom around me. Now, I may be persecuted. This is not a formula for everything that I want, and yet it is a formula for discovering perhaps that I have everything that I need. Maybe that's what inheriting the earth means in a sense. It also is a formula for letting the kingdom of heaven begin to flourish on earth. Working backwards, I want to suggest, is a great way of, if we jump to the end of the story, if you want to think about the way that God works, think about the crucifixion of Jesus. And at Jesus' crucifixion, he models all of the things that we see in the entire Sermon on the Mount. He is meek, he is merciful, he is actually attempting to be a peacemaker, and it costs him great persecution, and yet he loves his enemies. What can be more loving than saying, Father, forgive them, for they don't know what they're doing? And he could have called down legions of angels and destroyed all those who crucified him. Instead, he allowed them to kill him. That's completely backwards to everything the earth thinks. And those who crucified him thought that they had done away with this troublemaker. And yet God uses that crucifixion, working backwards, using death to bring brand new, different life into the world through the resurrection. And so what happens when we participate in doing things backwards to the way the world does it? When we participate in those things, it actually brings the kingdom of heaven in a greater way into the world, even if there is a negative impact for us. And again, going back to Martin Luther King, he had the long view, and he said the moral arc of the universe bends towards justice, and he recognized that even taking some short-term, incredibly painful losses, even his own death, would have the longer-term effect of the kingdom of heaven being brought to earth. And he talked about the beloved community is the way he put that, but that was the kingdom of earth. The kingdom of heaven, excuse me. In the Lord's Prayer, which Jesus also teaches in the Sermon on the Mount, we pray, Thy kingdom come, Thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. And so when we do those things, God's will and kingdom are brought to earth as they are done in heaven, and we live as if we already are in heaven. You've probably heard it say, fake it till you make it. I saw someone recently say, faith it till you make it. Faith it until the kingdom of heaven starts blossoming around you. And it won't come without a fight. That's why crucifixion is there, and yet we're going to fight differently. We work the controls backwards because we have that greater vision, that greater, a longer view, if you will. Now that doesn't really answer the how, though, does it? I'm still having to explain, well, I can't do that. I can't forgive those who persecute me. I can't love my enemies. I just can't bring it. I don't have enough moral testitude or fortitude or whatever you want to call it to be able to do that. Well, how do we do that? Well, that's why I wanted to bring up that 20th verse. the 20th verse, that says, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and the Pharisees, you'll never enter the kingdom of heaven. And he's not talking about after death. He's talking about right here and now. Well, what do you mean? The scribes and Pharisees were all about legalism, and they wanted to make sure that every jot and tittle was done, and I had to do everything just right, and they couldn't do it, and nobody else can do it. Why in the world would Jesus say that? Well, it's because you may remember a few weeks ago we were talking about what the word righteousness means. And righteousness in the Bible doesn't mean perfect living, right living, or perfect living. Righteousness means the right relationship. If I have the right relationship with God, then I'm righteous. And so even though Abraham had lots of sin in his life, it says in Genesis, it was reckoned to him as righteousness because he believed God, because he was in this relationship with God. And then, of course, the book of Hebrews picks that up as well. Righteousness is relationship. How do I do this? It's not through my strength, but it's through the relationship that I have with Jesus. And the more I am putting myself at His feet, at the Sermon on the Mount, in my time of prayer, in times of study, the more I'm putting myself at His feet, not just studying about Jesus, but letting Jesus really teach me, the more He is strengthening me, the more He is giving me everything I need in order to do the things that He's calling me to do. I have a friend who is just an incredible missionary in North Charleston, South Carolina, and he runs a nonprofit down there that is revitalizing a neighborhood there, and by revitalizing that neighborhood, in a sense, is revitalizing the entire town. And one of the things that he used to do, I assume he still does, is that every single night before he goes to bed, he would read the entire Sermon on the Mount. Now, it's not that much. It's just 3 chapters of the Bible, but he takes the time to read Matthew 5, 6, and 7 every single night. And it's not just as a thing to check off his to-do list, but it's a way that he sits at the feet of Jesus and lets Jesus teach him each night. And I don't know that he does this. I imagine that if I did that, then every day there would be a different piece of the Sermon on the Mount that would speak to that day, or maybe speak to what was going to happen in the next day. I knew I had a difficult thing coming up, or I knew I had a particular task that day, and that part of the Sermon on the Mount would speak to me. What a wonderful way of not saying, well, I'm going to do all of these things, but I'm going to let Jesus do all of these things. And then it's actually a little easy, if you will, I say that almost tongue-in-cheek, but not really, to let the righteousness be greater than the scribes and the Pharisees. Because it's not all about, well, what I do, and making sure that I do hit all of those checklists like they were doing, but it's kind of, who do I know? How do I get to who do I know? And that's Jesus. And how is He strengthening me? My brother-in-law is a lawyer, and he has a t-shirt that's kind of funny. It says, a good lawyer knows the law, a great lawyer knows the judge. And we really know the judge, and it's not that we would know that we know the judge and so God will do things unethically toward us, which is kind of what that t-shirt maybe be suggesting about the law. But rather than working really hard to fulfill the law in my life, I know the judge. I know the one who can set me free from all of that and then free me up to be able to live just like He wants me to live. So let me invite you perhaps to read the entire Sermon on the Mount today, or maybe even decide, well, I'm going to maybe during Lent each day read the entire Sermon on the Mount, or find other ways that work for you that you can put yourself at the feet of Jesus and learn from Him. Not just about Him, but learn from Him. And we do that, of course, because He is our living Lord, because God is with us. Amen.